Morning. It is 10 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. It is Nick, yeah. Thanks for being here this morning. Appreciate Steve filling in for me 2 out of the last 3 weeks. It's been kind of hectic, but hopefully I'm here for a while. So that's my hope. We're continuing our study going through the Gospel of Matthew. This is our 8th lesson, and we're going to begin chapter 8. And chapters 8 and 9 sort of go together when you're going through Matthew's Gospel, and so that's kind of the frame of mind that we'll be looking through this. But we're going to keep crawling through as we have been. We kind of rushed through the Sermon on the Mount, but I think most of us are pretty familiar with that. So these chapters, Matthew 8 and 9, they sort of make up one unit, and what they are narrative accounts, and they're sort of the middle between these two different discourses. You may remember when we introduced this book, we talked about how in Matthew's Gospel there are these 5 great discourses where it's just big units of teaching from Jesus. And so that's one of the themes of Matthew's Gospel account, is the idea of sitting at the feet of the master teacher, something that would have been prevalent to Matthew's probably Jewish readers. And so what we're reading in Matthew chapters 8 and 9 is right in between 2 units of discourse. The first happens to be the Sermon on the Mount. The second is going to be Matthew chapter 10. That's the second discourse. And so this narrative is right in between those two. And the bulk of these accounts are miracles that are performed by Jesus. This is what we read about. And some, depending on how you might structure this, look at what we read in Matthew chapters 8 and 9 as 3 different triads of miracles. To do that, you kind of have to, because there's 10 in total, but you kind of have to clump 2 of them together, which you could do, because they kind of happen one after the other. And so the bulk of these accounts are miracles that are performed by Jesus. And one thing that, at least to my eye, that seems to be sticking out is this idea of authority from Jesus. You think about the purpose of miracles, and Amos on Wednesday nights a few months ago taught us some of the miracles of Jesus. And the big takeaway from that class, when you look at it as a whole, is the idea that these miracles, one of the things that they do is they prove the authority of Jesus, and they thus prove the authority of his teachings as well. And these things that Jesus does in these chapters, it's coming off of some authoritative teaching from Jesus. And so Matthew chapter 7 ends in this way. When Jesus finished these sayings, this is the Sermon on the Mount, beginning in chapter 5, going through chapter 7. It says, "The crowds were astonished, or they marveled at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority, and not as their scribes." And so this is something that people noticed in Jesus. They noticed that he was teaching with authority. And I don't know if this means that he had a particular command of the subject matters, or perhaps some of the miracles that he had done before also played a hand in some of this. But regardless, we see that Jesus taught with authority, and the people noticed that. They perceived that. And another thing that's interesting is not only does Jesus teach with authority, but the things he does, the miracles he performs, those also showcase his authority. Think about, for example, these words from the Apostle Peter in Acts chapter 2, when he's speaking there at the day of Pentecost, and he says, "Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves know." And so God attested to who Jesus is through the things that he did, through these mighty works and these wonders and these signs that Jesus was able to perform. And we're going to read of some of these here beginning in Matthew chapter 8. And there's an interesting thread when you think about coming off of Jesus teaching as one with authority and the people perceiving that. Then he performs these miracles which showcase his authority. And when you get to the next discourse in Matthew chapter 10, more or less what happens there is Jesus delegates his authority to the 12. He delegates to them, and they're able to go and to carry out some of these things that he wanted them to do and teach the things he wanted them to teach. And so this unit here, one of the things that we're seeing that Matthew is showcasing to us and that he's showcasing to his Jewish readers is the authority that Jesus has. He's more than just a teacher. He's someone who teaches with authority. He's someone who showcases his authority by the mighty works that he's able to do. And so with that in mind, we're going to look at this. And in our study this morning, just for the sake of time, because I want us to process what we're doing, I don't want to rush through this, we're going to look at what is thought of as the first sort of triad of miracles that Jesus performs, and these take place in chapter 8. And so this morning we'll go through about verse 17, if I can get through all of my material, which is a big if. And so with that in mind, let's get into Matthew chapter 8. In verse 1 it says, when he came down from the mountain, that again is looking back in the Sermon on the Mount, it says that great crowds followed him. Now there's something interesting that's going on, and this is something that we as Americans might miss, but Matthew's Jewish readers, I think, would have picked up on this. And it comes from this quotation, when he came down from the mountain. To us, that's simply looking back at the Sermon on the Mount. Okay, he's coming down from the mountain. This is a transition from one event to something else. But one thing that Matthew, I think, is doing is he's recalling something else. He's drawing a parallel to something else. One thing that's interesting, if you look, this is almost a word-for-word quotation from Exodus 34 and verse 29. And this is when Moses comes down from Mount Sinai after receiving the law. And so one of the things, if you look into this, there's a lot of parallelisms between Jesus and Moses. Jesus is on a mountain. Moses receives the law on a mountain. Well, Jesus is sort of receiving and showing the fulfillment of the law there on that mountain. And so there's a lot of parallels there, and this is something I think Matthew's Jewish readers would have picked up on, especially with almost a word for word, if not a quotation, then certainly an allusion to Moses coming down from the mountain in Exodus chapter 34. And I think to look at that, you have to look at the Septuagint translation of that, which is the Greek translation of the original Hebrew Old Testament, which was the Bible that they would have used at that time. And so this is drawing Matthew's readers to parallel Jesus with Moses. And this is something that you see a lot of. Moses prophesied about this, saying there's going to be a prophet like me that's going to come later. Jesus is ultimately that prophet. The writer of Hebrews will take it even further, saying not only is Jesus like Moses, but he's better than Moses. And so that's something that the Hebrew writer picks up on. And we see the parallel here that Matthew seems to be drawing between Jesus and with Moses, and between Jesus teaching on the mountain and Moses receiving the law on Mount Sinai. And so that's something that we could pick up on from here. Something that we may not readily recall, but Matthew's Jewish readers, I think, certainly would have, because they were much more familiar with the Jewish Bible than we are. We also see that great crowds followed him. And they followed him primarily because he taught as one who had authority. They have perceived the authority of Jesus, and they've picked up on that, and now they say, this is someone that we need to pay close attention to. And so they follow him. And now we are at the point in Jesus' ministry where he's drawing these crowds. We also, you may remember from chapter 4, Jesus' fame had already spread throughout the Syrian region, and that's primarily because of the things he was doing there in chapter 4. He performed healings and cast out demons and so on. And so his fame has already spread, and it just seems to keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger with the more things he's doing and the more things he's teaching, the more authority that he's able to showcase. And so now we are at the point where great crowds follow him. And some people, when you're in front of a big crowd, sometimes they shrink up. Jesus doesn't do that. He lives up to the moment, and he's going to live up to the reputation that he's getting. So now in verse 2, we see someone approach him. It says, behold, a leper came to him and knelt before him, saying, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. This is one of my favorite stories in Matthew's Gospel and in all of the Bible. You may recall a few months ago I actually did a sermon from this passage. we see a leper comes to Jesus. And a leper is someone who has leprosy. And leprosy was, and perhaps still is, there's debate about what specifically they're referring to when they refer to leprosy here in the New Testament. But leprosy was a serious skin condition. Something that would spread quickly. Something that if you caught it, you had to be quarantined. You had to isolate yourself. And so you would be isolated from all of the camp. You had to go outside of the camp, you may recall. Some of you may remember Tom's class through Leviticus, and this comes up in Leviticus chapters 13 and 14. Whereas not only did you have to quarantine yourself, but you were considered unclean under the Mosaic law. You were considered ceremonially unclean. And so a leper approaches Jesus. And this is kind of an extraordinary thing, because lepers are typically secluded from society. And yet we see this leper come and approach Jesus. We also see that the leper knelt before him. That's what the ESV translates this as. The word knelt, in the original language, that word is proskuneo. And that word is very commonly in the New Testament translated as worship. And in fact, if you have a New King James, that's how they translate this word. He came and worshipped him. The New American Standard simply says bowed. Others, I think, say knelt or something similar to that. And so this is sort of the idea behind this word, this idea of showing reverence to somebody. And so the leper, through his physical posture, he's conveying his dependence on and his submission to the Lord. If you're kneeling before someone, you see the separation there with the posture. One's elevated above the other one. That's showing you something, whether you realize it or not. And for the leper to come and to kneel before Jesus, whether it's in worship or because he's asking for something, regardless of that, he's showing his dependence and his submission to the Lord. And he says this statement, "Lord, if you will, you can make me clean." Notice his question isn't if Jesus can. It's if Jesus wills, or if Jesus desires to do that, if he wants to, is the idea behind that. He knows that Jesus can do this. He's, I'm sure, seen the things that Jesus has done, if he's been in that area for very long. And he perhaps has heard some of the things that Jesus has taught. It was evident that Jesus was somebody who had authority. And we'll also see that in the next story with the centurion. So it's not a matter if Jesus can. It's if Jesus is willing to do it. And one thing also to point out, and this, I guess, pertains to leprosy. Notice that this isn't considered a healing. He doesn't say, if you will, you can heal me. He says, you can make me clean. This is a cleansing, not necessarily a healing, although it is a physical ailment that this person with leprosy would have had. But it's considered a cleansing. It's more than just physical. It's also ceremonial as well. And we'll see that at the end of this when he tells the leper to go and present himself to the priest. And so this leper comes and approaches Jesus and says, "Lord, if you will, you can make me clean." Then in verse 3, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, "I will," or "I am willing, be clean." And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. This is one of the reasons why I really like this story, is because Jesus stretches out his hand and touches him. In the next story, Jesus doesn't have to touch anyone. In fact, Jesus isn't even in the vicinity of the person, and he heals him. Jesus speaks it into existence in the next story with the centurion's servant. So he doesn't have to reach out and touch somebody to heal them. And yet Jesus reaches out and touches this leper. And it makes you wonder why. Well, there's something to this, I think. One aspect of this is, according to the law of Moses, you can read this in the book of Leviticus, if you touch a person with leprosy, that would make you unclean. You would be ceremonial unclean, and you would have to go cleanse yourself before the priest if you didn't catch the leprosy. And so, does Jesus violate the Mosaic law here? Some people argue, yes, he does violate it. one thing that's interesting, the Mosaic Law doesn't make it so that you're unclean. It tells you that you are. That's something that's worth pointing out here. It simply states that this happens to you. The law doesn't make it that way. The law is telling you that it's that way. But we see something that's interesting here. Typically, if you touch someone with leprosy, you would become unclean. But with Jesus, the opposite happens. Instead of the leper making Jesus unclean, Jesus makes the leper clean. This is a really interesting thing that we see happening here, and I think this is perhaps why Jesus reaches out and touches him. And he says, I will be clean. This is a good thing, because not only is Jesus able to cleanse this man, but he's willing to cleanse this man, and consequently he does it. He cleanses him. There's a parallel that you could draw, and this is the parallel I made in the sermon I preached on this a few months ago, with us and with our sin. Not only is Jesus able to cleanse us from our sin, but he was willing to do so. And he demonstrated that by going to the cross and dying for us. And so with this story, you have not only a real example of a miracle that Jesus does, but you have some foreshadowing leading up to the cross. Because just as he was willing to cleanse this man, he's willing to cleanse you and I of our sin as well. And he demonstrated that by going to the cross. Think about this from Peter in 1 Peter chapter 2. When he says in verse 24, he himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you've been healed. Jesus heals us. He cleanses us from our sin through the cross. We see at the end of this verse, immediately this man's leprosy was cleansed. One thing that is interesting, I've had discussions with people about this before, about these healings that supposedly take place today. You may hear of some of them. You may see them portrayed in movies or in television or so on. But unlike those supposed miraculous healings today, his leprosy is cleansed immediately. And the things that take place today that they say take place, you don't see it happen immediately. It's a process. I'll share this as an example. I should have asked permission, but I don't think he'll mind. CJ isn't here. He's with his dad. So, CJ, I apologize if this is wrong with me, but CJ was telling me a few weeks ago, he has cerebral palsy, if you weren't aware of that, and he was telling me he was having a conversation with a religious person over social media, and the religious person said, well, I'm gonna heal you. CJ said, well, by all means, heal me, dude. I want to be healed. Heal me. And the guy, I think he said a prayer or something. Lo and behold, CJ wasn't healed. And the guy said, well, it takes time. It takes, it's a process. And CJ rightly pointed out to him, well, that's not how it is in the Bible. When there's these healings that take place, it's instantaneous. We'll see that with each example here. It's instantaneous. You go through the book of Acts, it's instantaneous. You don't see that today because I would argue it doesn't happen. Yeah. See, he told Amos the story too. Yeah. And so his leprosy is cleansed immediately. This shows you just how miraculous this really is. Because if you've ever had skin problems, if you've ever had eczema or psoriasis or anything like that, you understand that it takes some time and it takes some treatment. Well, this happens immediately. And notice again the language. His leprosy is cleansed. I think that language is intentional by Matthew, something that would stand out to his Jewish readers. And this part here is really interesting, I think. In verse 4, Jesus said to him, see that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the gift that Moses commanded for a proof to them. There's a lot you could say about Jesus saying, don't say anything to anybody. There's a concept known as the messianic secret that you could talk about. It's more prevalent in other gospel accounts, in particular in Mark's gospel account, where Jesus does these miracles and he says, hey, don't tell anybody. And more times than not, they usually go tell people anyway. But for the sake of time, we won't spend a lot of time on that. But notice what Jesus tells them to do. Go show yourself to the priest and offer the gift that Moses commanded. One of the things that Jewish people might have had a problem with Jesus, as they might have thought, or they may have perceived that he was coming to abolish the law. And in fact, he addresses that in Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 through 20, when he says, "Don't think I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." And we see here Jesus is living up to that. Because under the law of Moses, to be fully ceremonially clean, you had to go present yourself to the priest so that they were aware of it, right? And you had to offer a gift and so on and so forth. And so Jesus is living up to what he is saying. I haven't come to abolish it, I've come to fulfill it. And here he's fulfilling the law by having this person who he's just cleansed go and offer his gift that Moses commanded. And so once again, we see Jesus isn't coming to overthrow the law, he comes to fulfill it. And that's ultimately what he will do, and that's something that Matthew is drawing out here as well. So that's the end of the first miracle. Are there any comments on any of that? We got two more to get through in about 25 minutes. Tom?
The part there that we just covered there, that's Leviticus 14, that only the priest could declare clean.
Right. Leviticus 14, Tom says. Only the priest could make you clean, and so to be fully ceremonially clean, he had to go present himself to the priest. All right. Now we come to this next miracle, and this is one that I really like too. In fact, I wrote a term paper on this account in college, and I'm not going to talk about the aspect that I wrote about because it's kind of funky. If you're curious about that, you can ask me afterward. But now we have this story of a centurion and the healing of his servant. So verse 5, when Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came forward to him, appealing to him, "Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, suffering terribly." We see that before it's a leper, now it's a centurion who approaches Jesus. And a centurion, if you're not aware, is a Roman official who is in charge of 100 men. And you can kind of see where you can kind of see that in the word centurion. You can see the word century in there. Century means 100. And one thing that's important about this is this centurion is more likely than not a Gentile. That's going to play an important role when you get to Jesus' response to the faith that this centurion shows. And so this centurion comes up. He's going to point out he has authority. And he implores Jesus, he appeals to him to heal his servant. And so this is the need that he has. He needs his servant to be healed. This evidently was one of the more important servants that the centurion had. It's important enough for him to seek out Jesus to come and to heal him. And one detail about this that's really important is this: the servant is at home. He's not physically present for Jesus here. And that's going to be important because Jesus is going to heal him even though he's not physically present. The servant is at home. He's paralyzed. He can't move. And so Jesus responds, and he said to him, "I will come and heal him." Now, once again, this is a really interesting thing. In the original language, you don't have punctuation. You don't have commas, you don't have periods, you don't have question marks, you don't have exclamation points. So you kind of have to infer things as you're translating them. And some translations infer this as a question when he says, "I will come and heal him." The NIV and the Christian Standard in particular actually translate this as a question. Some might have a footnote here. The English Standard might. I don't know if it does or not. No, it doesn't. But some translations might have a footnote here that may say this could be a question or something like that. And some will translate this, instead of "I will come and heal him," they say, "Well, shall I come and heal him?" And they kind of read a little bit into the tone that Jesus has with his response to this. One is Jesus complying, saying, "I will come and I will heal him." The other is perhaps Jesus resisting a little bit. Am I going to come and heal him? That's how they read into that. And the reason that they read into that in that way is because of the relationship between Jews and Gentiles at that time. There's an example later on with the Syro-Phoenician woman where she comes and she wants to be healed. And Jesus says, well, I'm here for the house of Israel. That's when she responds, even the dogs get the crumbs from the table and so on and so forth. We'll talk more about that when we get to it. But some say, well, in light of that, it's more likely that Jesus is responding in resistance here. My opinion is, in the context of this chapter, it seems more like he's doing so in compliance than he is by resistance. It just doesn't seem to fit with the other things we read in this chapter. And so it seems like he's saying, I'll come and heal him. He's willing to do it. He was just willing to heal the leper. He's going to be willing later on. He's going to heal a lot of people. Seems like he's willing in this instance. He's not meeting them with resistance. At least I don't think. It's just a matter of opinion. Because again, in the original language, you don't have punctuation. And so you kind of have to read into it a little bit. Those Greeks, as smart as they were, they didn't have punctuation. Who could imagine? Verse 8, the centurion replied, Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only say the word, and my servant will be healed. The centurion here, he rightly acknowledges his position in comparison to Christ. And you may have seen it before in verse 6 when he says, Lord, my servant is lying at home paralyzed. He acknowledges him as Lord, and then he acknowledges his unworthiness. I'm not worthy for you to even come under my roof. And this is likely a Jew and Gentile sort of a distinction. Jews weren't supposed to have fellowship with Gentiles. And so the centurion, likely being a Gentile, would have perhaps known, I'm not even worthy for you to be in my house because I'm part of that group of people, and your people don't mix with my people. That's perhaps what's going on here. I don't know if it's that or if maybe this centurion just has sorrow for the way that he's lived his life or what have you, but it seems probably like a Jew and Gentile thing, especially in light of Jesus' response to what he says. So he says, Lord, I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof. He rightly acknowledges his position in relation to the Christ. But then we see this great deal of faith. But only say the word, and my servant will be healed. This is an exemplary display of faith. Because not only does he realize Jesus has the ability to heal his servant, similar to the leper, if you will, you can make me clean, right? What the leper said before. The centurion knows he can do it, but he knows he doesn't even have to be physically present and able to do it. He can just say the word, and the centurion's servant would be healed. This is a great deal of faith. And we see the reason why he has this faith. For I too am a man under authority, with soldiers under me, 100 in particular. And I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it. And so the reason for the centurion's faith is because he has authority, and he recognizes the authority of Jesus. He perhaps was there for some of the teachings of Jesus, there at the side of the mountain. He perhaps has seen some of the things that Jesus has done. Regardless of that, Jesus' authority is able to be perceived by many different kinds of people of many different walks of life. You have someone who's a leper, who's an outcast of society. He perceives it. And now you have a centurion, someone with a great deal of authority in charge of 100 men. He perceives it as well. And as someone who has authority, he understands how authority works. You say the word, and they do it. He realizes Jesus has this level of authority, not just over people, but over diseases, illnesses, demons, and so on. When Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those who followed him, truly I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found such faith. Jesus doesn't marvel very often. And so when he does, you better pay attention to what he's marveling at. Typically, other people are marveling at Jesus. But now he's marveling at this centurion. And what he's marveling at is his faith. And he says, truly, I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found such faith. I think Jesus knows what he's doing when he says this, because in saying this, he's not only commending the faith of the centurion, he's also putting down Israel, and in particular Israel's leaders, at the same time. With no one in Israel have I found such faith. The Gentile has more faith than the people of Israel did. That's saying something. And that's something that these Jewish people, in particular the leaders, the Pharisees and the scribes, they wouldn't have liked to have heard that very much. So they thought they were people of great faith. He goes on to say, I tell you, many will come from east and west and recline at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness. And in that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. He touches on this idea of reclining at the table. Reclining at the table, that's how you sat at a table. You would recline, meaning you'd sit on the floor and you would lay kind of flat. This was how they would eat at the time. That was the formal way of eating. And he talks about reclining at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Those are the patriarchs of the people of Israel. And this is in the kingdom of heaven. One thing that's interesting is, as I understand it, a banquet was a prominent theme of Jewish eschatology. Eschatology being the study of end times, study of heaven, and so on and so forth. And they likely get this from a prophecy in Isaiah. I don't remember the quotation off the top of my head. I should have wrote it down. But there's a message in Isaiah kind of pertaining to this idea. And so they thought of heaven as being able to have table fellowship with their patriarchs and with their fathers and with their brothers and sisters that had preceded them and so on and so forth. And he points out here, Jesus does, that many people from the east and the west will come here. Some say that this is pertaining to people who are in exile. Based on the context of this story, I don't think that's what's happening. I think this is referring to Gentiles. People coming from all over the place, not just from Israel, are going to be at this banquet. And notice who's excluded from this. Sons of the kingdom. That's pertaining to the people of Israel. And so what Jesus is pointing out here is, as the Jewish people thought of it, they had a one-way ticket to heaven simply because of their heritage, simply because of who they were, because they were the people of Israel, because they were God's chosen people. That's how they thought of it. And Jesus is challenging their presumption here by pointing out there's going to be some people that are Gentiles that are going to be there, and there's going to be some of you that aren't going to be there. I think of this, that John the Baptizer told them. I believe this is the scribes and Pharisees, maybe the Sadducees, when John is baptizing people in the Jordan and they come down to see what the commotion is about. And John tells them, don't presume to say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our father. That was how they thought of things. Well, Abraham's our father. We have a one-way ticket, more or less. But John goes on to tell them, every tree, therefore, that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. And so John, in Matthew 3, challenges this presumption, and Jesus is doing the same thing here in Matthew chapter 8. They presumed that they were in the right, and really, they're not. It's this centurion who's in the right in this moment. And so Jesus says to the centurion, go, let it be done for you as you have believed. And the servant was healed at that very moment. Once again, we see that Jesus continues to commend this great display of faith by the centurion by healing his servant. And as we see once again, he's healed at that very moment. It's instantaneous. And he's not even physically present. This is a great thing that Jesus has done, a great display, something that would have really cemented the faith of that centurion and probably that servant, I would imagine, as well. Now we come to the third miracle that we'll look at today. This is the third of the first triad. Verse 14, and when Jesus entered Peter's house, Peter evidently lived in that area. We saw him get called before. He saw his mother-in-law lying sick with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she rose and began to serve him. One thing that's really interesting about this, Peter has a mother-in-law. I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but this implies that Peter was in fact married. Kind of an interesting thing, huh? Some religions try to, they try to say, well, to become a member of clergy or to become, whatever, you have to be celibate. You can't be married. Well, Peter was married, and they say Peter was the first one. So Peter doesn't meet their standard, so there's an inconsistency there. Peter was married. And so there's this instance that Jesus has with Peter's mother-in-law. She's ill, and it says he touched her hand and the fever left her. Once again, the healing seems instantaneous. It's not a long, drawn-out process. It's instant. And Peter's mother-in-law shows us how we should respond to the healing power of Jesus. She rose and began to serve him. Us also, when we receive, through obeying the gospel, the healing power of Jesus, healing us, cleansing us of our sin, we respond in service to him. Just an interesting parallel that you could make. And now we have, in verses 16 and 17, sort of a summary of what we've seen. And so verse 16 says, "That evening they brought to him many who were oppressed by demons, and he cast out the spirits with a word and healed all who were sick." And so this serves as sort of a summary statement. This is something that Matthew does frequently. He'll tell a few things, and then he kind of tells a thing at the end to summarize it. In fact, he does that quite a lot through this unit in chapters 8 and 9. And what we see him pointing toward, this summary is pointing toward one of the major themes of Matthew's gospel, that being the fulfillment of prophecy, which we see in verse 17. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah when he said, "He took our illnesses and bore our diseases." This is a quotation from Isaiah 53 and verse 4. This is known as the suffering servant chapter in Isaiah and in the whole Bible. You look at Isaiah 53 and it talks about the suffering nature of the one who was to come. And that clearly is fulfilled through Jesus. And one thing about this quotation, something that Matthew is doing here for his Jewish readers, because they would have been pretty familiar with Isaiah 53, it's highlighting not just the person of Jesus, but it's highlighting the ministry of Jesus. It highlights who he is and what he's come to do. He's not only one who has the ability to take illnesses, but he's someone who actually does it. He not only has the ability, but he has the desire to do it. And so as we look in conclusion at this unit that we've looked at, these first three miracles in Matthew chapters 8 and 9, they highlight obviously Jesus' authority, and that's something that we'll draw on continuously as we go through this. But we also see Matthew highlighting Jesus' nature and Jesus' mission. And by nature, I more mean his temperament, because we know he has godly nature and also human nature. But just his temperament as someone who is willing to bring healing, to serve people. And that speaks to his mission. We see with the story with the leper that he wills, at least in that instance, that the leper be cleansed. I think he wills that we be cleansed as well. I think that we could apply that to ourselves. And we see his actions here in these stories. What he's doing and what he's going to keep doing as we go through this, you could summarize it with the idea of liberation, freeing people from things. Which, by the way, you could parallel that to Moses, because Moses freed the people from Egypt, right? Another parallel between Moses and Jesus. In this instance, Jesus is liberating, he's freeing people from these diseases, and he's going to heal them, free them from demonic possession. One thing that we see here is this is looking ahead to the mission of the cross. Because just as he's freeing people here from this suffering, from diseases and demons and so on, by way of the cross, Jesus will liberate us from sin. And that's something, as we continue to build toward Jerusalem, that's going to become more and more evident in Matthew's gospel account. That's our class this morning. Any questions or comments? Amos?
When Jesus talks about the centurion's faith, how he was impressed with it. There's another place where Jesus mentions his impressed at the magnitude of the faith as the Phoenician woman.
Yeah.
Remember? And he says something very similar there too. And in both of these instances, these are not Jewish people.
Right. Yeah, we see Jesus is impressed with the faith of these Gentile people. Amos pointed out another example of Jesus being impressed by the faith of someone is the story of the Syrophoenician woman. Similar to the centurion, that woman is also a Gentile. And so one thing we see with Matthew's gospel, it's not only something, you're not only proving Jesus to be the Jewish Messiah, you're also downplaying the Jewish religion, because the way the Jewish religion was at that time, it wasn't the way God intended it to be. And so that's why Jesus comes along. Jesus is the fulfillment of that. The Jewish religion was a shadow. Jesus is the substance of it. And we see all these examples, and Matthew is good in portraying these to us, showcasing not just the good faith of the Gentiles, but contrasting that with the bad faith of the Jewish leaders. And that's something that Jesus is going to point out continuously, and Matthew is going to really draw it out, especially when you get to the 7 woes in chapter 23. Anything else? All right, thanks for your attention.